Welcome to the Forest Studio Labs Podcast 1.1. You're joining us for a deep dive into the world of carnivorous plants.
Yeah, some really fascinating organisms.
They are fascinating.
Mhm.
And it's amazing to think that there are plants out there that actually, eat meat. It seems so counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It really does. I mean, we usually think of plants as, being passive and just sort of soaking up nutrients from the soil.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how did these meat-eating marvels come to be? Where did they evolve? And how have they managed to exist in such unique ways?
Well, to answer that, we need to look at their habitats.
Okay, so where do these carnivorous plants typically grow?
They're often found in places that are, pretty harsh for most other plants.
Harsh. How so?
Think about places like bogs, swamps, rocky outcrops, areas where the soil is really nutrient poor.
Ah, I see. So they've had to find alternative ways to get the nutrients they need.
Exactly. And that's where their carnivorous nature comes in.
Makes sense. But how many different types of carnivorous plants are there?
Oh, a lot more than you might think. There are over 860 different species.
Wow, 860. I had no idea.
Yeah, it's quite diverse. Each species has its own unique way of attracting, trapping, and digesting its prey.
So we've got the Venus flytrap, which is probably the most famous one. But what other kinds of traps are out there?
Well, there are pitcher plants, which have these long, tube-like leaves that fill with rainwater and digestive enzymes.
So the insects just fall into this pit and can't get out.
Pretty much. The pitchers often have slippery sides and downward-pointing hairs, making escape almost impossible.
Wow, that's ingenious. What else?
You also have sundews, which have sticky glands on their leaves that trap insects like flypaper.
Like a botanical glue trap.
Yeah, exactly. And then there are bladderworts, which are aquatic plants that have these tiny bladder-like traps that create a vacuum and suck in prey.
A vacuum trap. That's crazy.
It is pretty wild. And there are even more types of traps out there, each one more fascinating than the last.
So these plants have clearly evolved some incredible adaptations to survive in these challenging environments.
They really have. And it all comes down to, survival of the fittest.
Right, so those plants that were better able to obtain nutrients in these harsh environments were more likely to survive and reproduce, passing on those beneficial traits to their offspring.
Exactly. And over millions of years, these adaptations have been refined and honed, leading to the incredible diversity of carnivorous plants we see today.
It's a testament to the power of natural selection, isn't it?
It really is. It shows how life can adapt and thrive, even in the most unexpected of places.
Now, I'm curious about how these plants actually digest their prey. Do they have, like, a stomach or something?
Not exactly a stomach, but they do have specialized mechanisms for breaking down their food.
So how does it work?
Well, many carnivorous plants produce enzymes. These are proteins that help break down complex molecules into simpler ones that the plants can absorb.
So it's like their own version of digestion.
Precisely. They're essentially converting the insects they catch into a nutrient-rich soup that they can then absorb.
Wow, that's amazing. But do all carnivorous plants rely on enzymes for digestion?
That's a great question. Actually, some carnivorous plants have evolved these really interesting partnerships with other organisms to help them break down their prey.
Partnerships, you mean like teamwork?
Yeah, exactly. It's a fascinating example of mutualism where two different species benefit from each other.
So tell me more about these partnerships. How do they work?
Well, one example is the Rorigula plant, which is native to South Africa.
Okay, what's special about the Rorigula?
Well, it has these sticky leaves that are incredibly effective at trapping insects, but it actually lacks the enzymes to digest them directly.
So it can catch them but can't eat them. That seems counterproductive.
That's where the partnership comes in. The Rorigula has teamed up with a tiny assassin bug called Pomeridea.
And what does this assassin bug do?
Well, it's able to walk on the Rorigula's sticky leaves without getting trapped itself. It then feasts on the captured insects.
Ah, so the bug gets a free meal.
Exactly, and here's the key part. The Rorigula plant then absorbs nutrients from the bug's droppings.
So it's like the bug is pre-digesting the food for the plant.
In a way, yes. It's a brilliant example of how nature finds these elegant solutions to seemingly complex problems.
That's incredible. It shows how interconnected these ecosystems really are.
It really does, and it highlights the importance of understanding these relationships if we want to conserve these plants.
Speaking of conservation, I've heard that many carnivorous plant species are facing some serious threats.
That's right, unfortunately. A significant number of carnivorous plant species are threatened with extinction.
That's heartbreaking. What's causing this decline?
Well, habitat loss is the biggest threat by far.
Habitat loss, how so?
Human activities like agriculture, development, mining, these are all encroaching on the specialized habitats that these plants need to survive.
So we're essentially destroying their homes.
In a way, yes. And the sad part is that many of these habitats are already quite limited.
So even small losses can have a big impact on these plants.
Exactly. And on top of habitat loss, there are other threats like pollution and climate change, which can further degrade their remaining habitats.
It's a real shame. These plants are so unique and fascinating, and it would be a tragedy to lose them.
I agree. They're a precious part of our natural heritage, and we need to do everything we can to protect them.
Well, on that note, let's take a quick break. We'll be back in a moment to discuss some of the conservation efforts that are underway to safeguard these incredible plants. Stay tuned.
Sounds good. It's tough. These plants have adapted over millions of years to these very specific environments, and now they're facing all these new challenges.
Right, and a lot of those challenges are, well, our fault.
Exactly. Human activities are having a major impact on these plants and their habitats.
So we talked about habitat loss, but what about things like pollution? How does that affect carnivorous plants?
Pollution can be a big problem, especially for plants that live in wetlands and bogs, which are very sensitive to changes in water quality.
What kind of pollution are we talking about here?
Well, agricultural runoff is a major concern. Fertilizers and pesticides from farms can wash into these habitats and disrupt the delicate balance of the ecosystem.
So these plants are adapted to nutrient-poor environments, and then suddenly they're getting bombarded with all these extra nutrients.
Exactly, and it can actually be harmful to them. They can't compete with other plants that thrive in nutrient-rich conditions, and they can end up being outcompeted.
Like they're being loved to death.
Well, yeah, in a way. And then there are things like industrial pollution and even air pollution, which can also have negative effects on these plants.
It's a reminder that everything is connected, isn't it? What we do in one part of the environment can have ripple effects elsewhere.
Absolutely. And these plants are often the canaries in the coal mine, so to speak. They're very sensitive to changes in their surroundings, so when they start to decline, it's a sign that something is wrong.
And speaking of things that are wrong, we can't forget about climate change.
Climate change is a huge threat to all sorts of plants and animals, and carnivorous plants are no exception.
How is climate change affecting these plants specifically?
Well, for one thing, it's altering rainfall patterns. Many of these plants rely on consistent moisture, and they're not adapted to prolonged droughts.
And as the climate changes, those droughts are becoming more frequent and more severe.
Exactly. And then there are things like rising temperatures, which can also stress these plants out.
So we've got habitat loss, pollution, and climate change. It's like a triple whammy.
It is, and it's why so many carnivorous plants are in trouble.
So what can we do about it? Is there any hope for these plants?
There is hope. There are a lot of people and organizations working hard to conserve these plants and their habitats.
That's good to hear. What kind of conservation efforts are underway?
Well, one of the most important things is habitat protection, creating protected areas like national parks and nature reserves where these plants can thrive without human disturbance.
So setting aside land specifically for their conservation.
Exactly. And within those protected areas, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to manage the habitat properly. Things like controlling invasive species, restoring degraded areas, and monitoring populations to make sure they're healthy.
It sounds like a lot of work.
It is, but it's worth it. These plants are so unique and valuable that we need to do everything we can to protect them.
I agree. Now, earlier we were talking about how some carnivorous plants have evolved these amazing partnerships with other organisms.
Oh, yeah. Those mutualistic relationships are fascinating.
They really are. And I was wondering, do those relationships have any implications for conservation?
Definitely. If we're going to conserve these plants, we need to understand and protect the entire ecosystem they're a part of.
So it's not just about protecting the plants themselves, but also the insects, bacteria, fungi, everything that interacts with them.
Exactly. It's about taking a holistic approach to conservation, recognizing that everything is connected and that if we lose one piece of the puzzle, the whole picture can fall apart.
It makes sense. It's like a delicate web, and if we break one strand, the whole thing can unravel.
It's a great analogy. And it highlights the importance of understanding these complex relationships if we want to be successful in our conservation efforts.
Now, we've talked a lot about the threats facing carnivorous plants, but Let's shift gears for a moment and talk about why these plants are so important in the first place.
Sure, they're not just fascinating to look at, they actually play important roles in their ecosystems.
So they're more than just pretty faces.
Exactly. For one thing, they help control insect populations, which can be beneficial for other plants and animals.
So they're like natural pest control.
You could say that. They also play a role in nutrient cycling, breaking down organic matter and releasing nutrients back into the soil.
It's amazing how these plants have found a way to thrive in such challenging environments.
It really is. They're a testament to the power of adaptation and the diversity of life on Earth.
And they're a reminder that we still have so much to learn about the natural world.
Absolutely. The more we study these plants, the more we realize how much we don't know.
But one thing we do know is that these plants are worth protecting.
Absolutely. They're unique, they're beautiful, and they play important roles in their ecosystems.
Well, this has been a really fascinating discussion. I feel like I've learned so much about these incredible plants.
Me too. It's always great to talk about something so interesting and important.
Now, before we move on, is there anything else you want to add about the conservation of carnivorous plants? Any key takeaways for our listeners?
Yeah, I think the most important thing to remember is that we all have a role to play in protecting these plants. Even small actions can make a difference.
Like what? What can our listeners do to help?
Well, for one thing, they can support organizations that are working to conserve carnivorous plants, either through donations or volunteering.
That's a great idea. What else?
They can also learn more about these plants and spread the word to others. The more people who know about these plants and the threats they face, the more likely we are to take action to protect them.
So education and awareness are key.
Absolutely. And of course, we can all do our part to reduce our impact on the environment in general. Things like reducing our carbon footprint, conserving water, and being mindful of our consumption habits.
All good advice. And if anyone wants to learn more about carnivorous plants, where should they go?
There are some great resources online. The International Carnivorous Plant Society has a website with a ton of information, and there are also a lot of great books and documentaries out there.
Perfect. We'll be sure to include some links in the show notes.
Great. I think that covers it.
Well, thanks again for sharing your expertise with us. It's been a really enlightening conversation.
It's been my pleasure. You know, it's really quite remarkable when you think about it. I mean, these plants have evolved these incredibly complex and sophisticated traps to capture and digest their prey.
Right, and we've talked about some of those traps already, the Venus flytrap, pitcher plants, sundews.
Yeah, but those are just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. There's a whole world of carnivorous plants out there, each with its own unique way of catching a meal.
So what are some of the other fascinating trap types that you find particularly intriguing?
Well, one that always comes to mind is the butterwort.
The butterwort. What's so special about that one?
Well, at first glance, they look pretty unassuming. They have these bright, colorful leaves that look almost succulent.
Innocent enough, right?
Exactly. But those leaves are actually covered in tiny, sticky glands that trap insects like flypaper.
Ah, so it's a deceptive trap. It lures them in with beauty, and then bam!
Exactly. Once an insect lands on those leaves, it's pretty much doomed. The more it struggles, the more stuck it gets, and eventually it's enveloped by the plant's digestive enzymes.
Like a botanical version of quicksand.
Yeah, kind of. And then there's the bladderwort, which we touched on briefly earlier.
Oh yeah, the one with the vacuum traps.
Exactly. These plants are amazing. They live in water and have these tiny bladder-like traps that can suck in prey in a matter of milliseconds.
Milliseconds, that's incredibly fast.
Yeah. It is. The traps work by creating a vacuum inside the bladder. When a tiny aquatic creature like a water flea triggers a hair on the bladder, the trap springs open, sucking in the prey along with a rush of water.
Wow, it's like a microscopic mousetrap.
It's a pretty incredible feat of engineering when you think about it. And then there are plants like the corkscrew plant, which has these long underground stems with inward-pointing hairs that force prey deeper and deeper into the trap.
So it's like a one-way tunnel to doom.
Exactly. And once an insect is trapped in there, it has no chance of escape. It's eventually digested by the plant's enzymes.
It's amazing how diverse these traps are, each one perfectly adapted to the plant's particular environment and prey.
It really is. And it just goes to show the incredible power of natural selection over millions of years. These plants have evolved these highly specialized and efficient ways of obtaining the nutrients they need.
Now, we've talked a lot about the biology of these plants, but I'm also curious about the conservation challenges they face. We know that many carnivorous plant species are threatened with extinction.
Yeah, it's a sad reality. Many of these plants are facing a lot of pressure from habitat loss, pollution, and climate change.
And as we discussed earlier, poaching is also a big problem, especially for rare and highly sought-after species.
It is, and it's heartbreaking to think that these plants, which have survived for millions of years, are now facing extinction because of human actions.
So what's being done to protect these plants? What can we do to help ensure their survival?
Well, one of the most important things is habitat conservation, protecting the areas where these plants naturally grow and ensuring that those habitats remain healthy and intact.
Right, because if we lose their habitats, we lose the plants.
Exactly. And that means creating protected areas like national parks and nature reserves, as well as working with the private landowners to manage their land in a way that benefits these plants.
So it's a combination of government action and individual responsibility.
Absolutely. And it also involves things like educating the public about the importance of these plants and the threats they face.
Raising awareness is key.
Yeah.
People need to understand why these plants are worth protecting and what they can do to help.
Exactly. The more people who care about these plants, the better chance they have of surviving.
Now, you mentioned earlier that some carnivorous plants have evolved these amazing mutualistic relationships with other organisms.
Oh, yeah, those relationships are crucial for the survival of some of these plants.
And I was wondering if those relationships also have implications for conservation.
They definitely do. If we want to protect these plants, we need to protect the entire ecosystem they're a part of, including the organisms they depend on for survival.
So it's not just about protecting the individual plant,
Hmm.
but also the insects, bacteria, fungi, everything that makes up its habitat.
Exactly. It's about taking a holistic approach to conservation, recognizing that everything is connected and that we can't just focus on one species in isolation.
It's like a jigsaw puzzle. You need all the pieces to complete the picture.
Precisely. And if we lose one piece, the whole picture can be irreparably damaged.
Well, this has been an incredible journey into the world of carnivorous plants. I've learned so much, and I'm truly grateful for your expertise.
It's been my pleasure. I'm glad we could share this fascinating world with you, and I hope our listeners will be inspired to learn more about these amazing plants and do what they can to protect them.
Absolutely. It's a responsibility we all share. And on that note, we'd like to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the captivating world of carnivorous plants.
It's been a fun one.
It really has. We hope you've enjoyed the journey, and until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep wondering about the incredible diversity of life on our planet.